So you think you're having a rough day because your coffee order was wrong or because someone cut you off in traffic, and now you're convinced the universe is personally against you, right? Well, let me tell you something that'll put your bad morning into perspective. There were actual moments in human history where one single person, just one regular human being who probably also had bad mornings, stood between all of humanity and complete annihilation. And I'm not talking about superhero movie stuff or dramatic Netflix documentaries with way too much slow motion footage. I'm talking about real people who made one decision, pressed one button, or refused to press one button. And because of that choice, you and I are sitting here today instead of being ancient radioactive dust floating somewhere in the atmosphere. Wild, isn't it? And the craziest part is that most of these people weren't trying to be heroes. They weren't looking for glory or a statue in their honor. They were just doing their job on what seemed like a normal day until suddenly it very much wasn't normal anymore. These are the stories that make you realize how insanely fragile human existence actually is, and how we've basically been playing the most dangerous game of chance for decades without even knowing it. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into some moments where humanity's survival literally came down to one person having a really good gut feeling, or just being stubborn enough to say no when everyone else was screaming yes. Let's start with probably the most terrifying oops almost ended the world moment in history. And it involves a guy named Stanislav Petrov who was just trying to get through his shift on September 26, 1983. Picture this. It's the height of the Cold War. Tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States are so high you could cut them with a knife, and everyone's basically waiting for someone to push the big red button that would turn the planet into a giant apocalyptic wasteland. Petrov is sitting in a Soviet nuclear early warning bunker, probably thinking about what he's going to have for dinner later, when suddenly the alarms start going off and the computer system is screaming that 5 count them. 5 nuclear missiles have been launched from the United States and are heading straight for the Soviet Union. Now, according to protocol, Petrov should immediately report this to his superiors, who would then launch a counter-strike which would trigger the Americans to launch more missiles, which would make the Soviets launch even more missiles. And congratulations, we've just started World War III and effectively ended human civilization as we know it. But here's where it gets interesting. Petrov looked at that screen, looked at all those flashing red warnings, and thought to himself, you know what, this doesn't feel right. And let me emphasize how absolutely insane this decision was, because this man had every reason to believe those warnings were real. The technology was supposed to be state-of-the-art. His training told him to follow protocol. His superiors would have expected him to report it immediately, and the consequences of being wrong could mean millions of Soviet citizens dying while he did nothing. But Petrov had this nagging feeling in his gut that something was off. Because if the Americans were really going to launch a first strike, why would they only send 5 missiles when they had thousands? That didn't make tactical sense. So he made the call to report it as a false alarm, and guess what? It was a false alarm caused by sunlight reflecting off clouds that the satellite system mistook for missile launches. One guy, one moment, one decision based on nothing but intuition and logical thinking, and he saved literally everyone on the planet from nuclear annihilation. And here's the kicker that really shows you how messed up the whole situation was. The Soviet government didn't give him a medal or throw him a parade. They actually reprimanded him for not filling out his paperwork properly during the incident. I'm not joking. The man saves the entire human species and gets in trouble for incomplete documentation. That's bureaucracy for you. But wait, there's more. Because apparently we love playing Russian roulette with extinction events. Let's talk about Vasily Arkhipov, another Soviet officer who basically told nuclear war to sit down and shut up during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. This time we're on a submarine, because why should only the people on land get to almost destroy the world, right? The submarine B-59 is deep underwater near Cuba. They've been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. They're being harassed by US Navy destroyers dropping depth charges, and the crew is exhausted, hot, and completely in the dark about what's happening on the surface. The captain and the political officer are convinced that World War III has already started and that they need to launch their nuclear torpedo at the American ships. And here's where the stakes get even crazier. This particular submarine required the agreement of 3 officers to launch a nuclear weapon, and 2 of them were already ready to push the button. But Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be the 3rd officer and also the flotilla commander, said no. He convinced them to surface and make contact with Moscow instead of immediately launching what would have been the opening shot of a nuclear war. Think about the pressure this guy was under. He's in a metal tube underwater. Everyone around him thinks the war has already started. They're being actively attacked by enemy ships, and he has to be the voice of reason telling everyone to calm down and not start the apocalypse. And he was right, because obviously World War III hadn't started yet, and his refusal to authorize that nuclear torpedo launch meant that it still wouldn't start that day. Now let's jump forward a bit and talk about a moment that's slightly less about nuclear weapons and more about one person noticing something weird before it became a catastrophe. In 1978, a medical photographer named Janet Parker became the last person to die from smallpox, and her death happened because of a laboratory accident at the University of Birmingham. But here's where the story gets interesting from a saving humanity perspective. A scientist named Jeffrey Smith and his colleagues were some of the first people to recognize something absolutely critical about how devastating a smallpox outbreak in the modern world could be if the virus ever escaped from the few labs that still kept samples. After Parker's death, there was this massive push to destroy almost all remaining smallpox samples worldwide, and Smith was instrumental in arguing for this and developing the safety protocols that would prevent another escape. The thing is, we'd already eradicated smallpox in the wild by that point. It was gone, defeated, humanity had won. But we kept these samples in labs for research, and Smith realized that in our modern interconnected world with air travel and dense cities, if smallpox got out again, it could spread faster and farther than it ever had in history. And since we'd stopped vaccinating people, almost nobody had immunity anymore. One outbreak could have killed hundreds of millions of people before we could even respond. So while this isn't a dramatic stop the missile launch moment, it's still a case where one person's insistence on proper safety protocols and his advocacy for destroying dangerous samples helped ensure that humanity wouldn't face a smallpox pandemic in the jet age. Sometimes saving the world isn't about dramatic last-second decisions. It's about being the annoying person in the room who keeps saying, "But what if something goes wrong?" until people actually listen. Speaking of pandemics, let's talk about a moment that's way more recent and proves that we're apparently still playing fast and loose with extinction-level scenarios. In the early days of gain-of-function research with viruses, there were scientists who stood up and said, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't be making viruses more dangerous just to see if we can." One of those voices was Lynn Klotz, who published research showing that laboratory escapes of dangerous pathogens happen way more often than anyone wants to admit, and that creating enhanced versions of already dangerous viruses was essentially playing with fire in a room full of dynamite. Now, I'm not going to get into all the politics and debates around this topic because that's a whole other can of worms. But what's important here is that there were individual scientists who looked at what was being proposed and said, the risk here isn't worth the potential benefit, and they fought to implement stricter safety standards and oversight. These weren't popular positions to take because a lot of researchers wanted to do this work and felt it was important. But having those dissenting voices meant that at least some safety measures were put in place that might have prevented something catastrophic. We may never know if one of those scientists specifically prevented a pandemic that could have been worse than anything we've seen. But that's kind of the point. The disasters that don't happen because someone was cautious don't make headlines, but they might be the most important saves of all. Let's go back to the Cold War era because apparently that was just an endless parade of "oh my god, we almost died" moments. There's this guy named Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence colonel who became a spy for the United States and United Kingdom, and the intelligence he provided was absolutely crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Penkovsky gave Western intelligence agencies the technical specifications and operational details of Soviet missiles, which allowed them to understand exactly what the Soviets were capable of and what they were actually deploying in Cuba. This information was critical because it meant that President Kennedy and his advisors could make informed decisions instead of just guessing about Soviet capabilities and potentially overreacting or underreacting in ways that could have triggered a war. Penkovsky knew that sharing this information was essentially a death sentence if he was caught, and spoiler alert, he was caught and executed in 1963. But the intelligence he provided helped prevent what could have been a nuclear exchange based on miscalculation or misunderstanding. He literally traded his life for information that helped keep the world from exploding, and most people have never even heard his name. That's the thing about a lot of these stories. The people who save humanity don't always survive to see the world they saved, and they often don't get recognition because what they did was classified or secret or just not dramatic enough for a Hollywood movie. Now let's talk about a different kind of save, one that involves computers and code instead of missiles and spies. In the late 1990s, there was growing concern about the Y2K bug, and while it's become kind of a joke now because the world didn't end and everyone thinks it was overblown panic, the reality is that the disaster didn't happen precisely because thousands of programmers and engineers worked their asses off to fix the problem before midnight on December 31st, 1999. But there were a few key individuals who sounded the alarm early and pushed for the massive remediation effort that prevented catastrophe. One of those people was Peter de Jager, who wrote an article in 1993 titled Doomsday 2000 that laid out exactly how bad things could get if the Y2K bug wasn't addressed. At the time, most people thought he was exaggerating or being alarmist, but the Jager kept pushing the issue, speaking at conferences, writing more articles, and basically refusing to shut up about it until people started taking it seriously. Because of early warnings from people like him, governments and corporations had years to prepare instead of months, and that preparation time is what prevented power grids from failing, financial systems from collapsing, and all the other nightmare scenarios that could have happened if every computer system suddenly thought it was the year 1900. This is another case where the save doesn't look dramatic because the disaster never happened, but make no mistake, if those systems had failed simultaneously across the globe, the cascading effects could have been catastrophic in ways that would have cost lives and destroyed infrastructure we depend on for survival. Here's a more recent one that most people don't know about because it involves the terrifying world of synthetic biology and artificial intelligence. In 2022, a team of researchers decided to see if AI could be used to design new toxic molecules, and they modified their drug discovery AI to suggest the most harmful compounds instead of helpful ones. Within just 6 hours, the AI had designed 40,000 potentially lethal molecules, including some that were predicted to be more toxic than VX nerve agent, one of the deadliest substances ever created. The researchers who did this experiment immediately published their findings, not to give bad actors a roadmap, but to warn the scientific community about the dangers of this technology being misused. One of those researchers, Fabio Urbina, became a vocal advocate for safety measures and regulations around AI-assisted molecular design, arguing that we need safeguards in place before this technology becomes widely available. Now you might be thinking, but nobody used this AI to actually create bioweapons, so how did this person save humanity? And the answer is that by revealing the danger early and advocating for safety measures, he and his colleagues are working to prevent a future where someone with bad intentions and access to this technology could create a pandemic in a bottle. This is the modern version of saving the world. Recognizing emerging threats before they become actual catastrophes and fighting to put guardrails in place while there's still time. And finally, let's talk about something that's happening right now, in our current moment, because the story of humanity not going extinct is still being written. There are climate scientists who have been sounding the alarm for decades about the existential threat of climate change. And while this isn't a single person, single moment save like Stanislav Petrov refusing to report a false alarm, there are individuals whose work and advocacy have been crucial in preventing us from sleepwalking into an uninhabitable planet. Scientists like James Hansen, who testified before Congress in 1988 about the dangers of global warming when it wasn't cool or popular or career-enhancing to do so, essentially put his reputation on the line to warn humanity about a slow-motion catastrophe. We do not know yet if his warnings and the warnings of scientists like him will ultimately save humanity, because we're still in the middle of this story. But the fact that we're finally starting to take action on climate change is in large part because these individuals refused to be silent even when it was professionally risky or politically inconvenient. This is what modern heroism looks like. It's not always dramatic or immediate. It's sometimes just the stubborn refusal to let humanity ignore a problem until it's too late to fix. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Humanity's continued existence is not guaranteed. It's not some cosmic right we have. It's the result of countless decisions made by individuals who chose to be cautious when they could have been reckless, who chose to speak up when they could have stayed silent, who chose to think critically when they could have just followed orders. We owe our lives to people whose names most of us will never know, people who had bad days and good days just like us, people who probably worried about their mortgages and their relationships and what to have for dinner, but who in crucial moments rose to the occasion and said no to disaster. And that's both terrifying and weirdly comforting, because it means that ordinary people can have extraordinary impact, that one person really can change the course of history, and that maybe, just maybe, you or I could be that person someday if we're paying attention and we're brave enough to act when it matters. Now I want to hear from you. What moment from this video hit you the hardest? Was there something that made you stop and really think about how fragile everything is, or maybe something that gave you hope about human nature and our ability to make the right call under pressure? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know what resonated with you. And if you want more videos like this that explore the weird, terrifying, and occasionally hopeful moments in history that shaped our world, make sure to let me know down in the comments and I'll keep them coming. Until next time, try not to accidentally end the world, okay?